The Mafia boss got a call from the hospital. She's dying, but she doesn't want to see you. Carlos's entire frame went still. Not the controlled stillness of a predator, but the paralysis of a man who's just taken a bullet he didn't see coming. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure to subscribe. New stories unfold here every day, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single one. And don't forget to comment which state you're watching from. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in. The whiskey glass froze halfway to his lips. Around him, the penthouse with its imported leather, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking an empire built on violence, suddenly felt like a cage. Sandra. The name carved through 15 years of carefully constructed walls. The name he'd trained himself not to think about when he ordered executions. The name that haunted the few hours he managed to sleep. The only person who'd ever called him Mijo instead of boss. What happened? Not a question. A command. His voice came out cold, sharp, each syllable a blade. The tone he used when men begged for mercy. But his hand betrayed him, knuckles white against the glass, the amber liquid trembling like a fault line before an earthquake. She's dying, Mr. Wilson. Amber's voice cracked, then steadied with clinical necessity. Stage 4. The doctors say, hours, maybe less. I thought you'd want to know. I'm on my way. Carlos was already standing, the chair scraping back, the glass abandoned on the desk. His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized, jaw tight, eyes hollow, the mask of invincibility fracturing in real time. Mr. Wilson, wait. The nurse's voice stopped him mid-step. Sir. She left specific instructions. The silence stretched like barbed wire. She said. Amber's voice dropped to barely a whisper, as if speaking the words might summon something terrible. She said she doesn't want to see you. She was very clear. Tell him not to come. Tell him I don't want to see him. The line didn't disconnect. Carlos simply lowered the phone, slowly, mechanically, until it hung loose in his hand. Through the window, the city sprawled beneath him, an empire of controlled chaos, of power absolute. He'd made politicians kneel. Made rivals vanish. Made an entire city whisper his name like a prayer or a curse. But he couldn't make his mother want to see him one last time. Sir. Amber's voice filtered through the speaker, distant now. Mr. Wilson, are you? Tell her I'm sorry. His voice was barely audible, scraped raw. Then, colder, harder, the crime lord rebuilding his armor. And tell her I'm coming anyway. He ended the call. In his mind, but to understand why Sandra Perez's rejection cut deeper than any bullet Carlos had ever taken, you have to go back. Back to before the empire. Before the name Carlos Wilson made grown men flinch. Back to when he was just a boy, and she was just a mother who believed, despite everything, despite the bruises and the arrests and the darkness gathering around her son, that love could save him. She'd been wrong. And now, as Carlos sped through rain-slick streets toward St. Helena Hospital, every red light felt like a confession. Every memory, a trial he'd already lost.
He elevator descended in silence. Each floor a countdown. Carlos couldn't stop. When the doors opened to the private garage, his driver, Marco, loyal for a decade, discreet as a grave, was already waiting beside the black Mercedes, engine purring. Where to, boss? St. Helena Hospital. Carlos's voice was flat, mechanical. And I'm driving. Marco's eyebrows lifted a fraction, the closest thing to shock Carlos had ever seen on the man's face. Sir, if there's a situation, protocol says. I said I'm driving. Carlos held out his hand. Marco hesitated for precisely 2 seconds before dropping the keys into his palm. Go home, Marco. Take the night off. Boss, if you're going into. Go home. The command landed with finality. Marco nodded once, stepped back, and disappeared into the shadows of the garage. Carlos slid behind the wheel, and for the first time in 15 years, he was alone. Truly alone. No guards, no guns, no empire watching his back. Just a man driving through the rain to see a woman who didn't want to see him. The Mercedes tore through the city like a bullet seeking its target. Rain hammered the windshield in sheets, the wipers struggling to keep pace. Carlos barely registered the red lights he ran, the intersections he blazed through. Time had become elastic, every second stretching and compressing, urgency and dread warring in his chest. 20 minutes, the nurse had said. Maybe less. His foot pressed harder on the accelerator. The city blurred past, neon signs bleeding into darkness, streetlights casting halos through the downpour. This was his kingdom, every block a territory carved and claimed, every corner a monument to his ambition. But tonight, driving through it alone, Carlos saw something else. He saw the scars. Flashback number 1, age 9. The kitchen light flickered as Sandra stood at the stove, stirring a pot of arroz con pollo at midnight because her shift at the community center had run late and her son hadn't eaten. Carlos sat at the table, knuckles scraped raw from fighting 3 boys who'd called him a bastard. Let me see, Sandra said, not turning from the stove. He showed her his hands. She'd sked softly, abandoned the rice, and knelt before him with a damp cloth and hydrogen peroxide. Mijo, you can't solve everything with your fists. They started it. And you finished it. She pressed the cloth to his split knuckles. He hissed. Being strong doesn't mean being violent. You understand. He didn't answer. She gripped his chin, forced him to meet her eyes. You're not your father, Carlos. You better. You have to be. Carlos blinked, and the memory dissolved. He was passing through the warehouse district now. His warehouse district. The buildings here moved product worth millions, facilitated deals that kept half the city's underworld functioning. But all he saw was the broken window of a pawn shop, shattered in a turf war he'd orchestrated 3 years ago. The owner had refused to pay protection, so Carlos sent a message. The man's son had been inside when the Molotov came through. The boy lived. Barely. Sandra had read about it in the papers. That was the last time they'd spoken. Flashback number 2, age 16. He came home at 4 a.m., blood on his shirt that wasn't his, cash in his pockets that wasn't earned. Sandra was waiting in the living room, rosary beads wrapped around her knuckles like brass knuckles of faith. Where were you? Out. Don't lie to me, Carlos. Her voice was ice. I know what you're doing. I know who you're running with. You don't know anything. She stood, crossed the room and slapped him. Not hard. Just enough to shock them both. Her hand trembled against his cheek. I know, she whispered, tears streaming, that you're becoming exactly what I prayed you'd never be. And I don't know how to save you anymore. He'd walked out. Didn't come back for 3 days. A police siren wailed somewhere to his left. Carlos's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. No lights, just the ambient glow of the city. But his hands tightened on the wheel anyway. Even now, especially now, the law was circling. Static crackled from a radio frequency he wasn't supposed to be able to intercept. A police scanner Marco had installed years ago, encrypted but accessible if you knew where to look. Carlos had forgotten it was even there until the voice filtered through. Unit 7-4, we've got a possible Wilson sighting. Black Mercedes, heading eastbound on Fulton. Advise. Copy that. Maintain distance. Do not engage without backup. Repeat, do not engage. So they knew. Course they knew. They always knew. But they also knew better than to stop him unless they had an army. Flashback number 3, age 24. The courtroom was packed, but Carlos only saw one face. Sandra, sitting 3 rows back, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. He'd been arrested for assault, charges that would have stuck if the witness hadn't mysteriously recanted. When he walked free, she was waiting outside. "I didn't do anything," he started. "I know you did." Her voice was hollow. "And I know you'll do it again. That's what terrifies me, Mijo. Not that you'll get caught. That you won't." She turned to leave. He grabbed her arm. "Mama, don't." She pulled away. "Don't call me that when you're covered in blood you're proud of." The hospital appeared ahead like a lit fortress. St. Helena, white and sterile against the black sky. Carlos slowed, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way gunfights had never managed. This was it. The place where everything ended or nothing changed. A squad car sat at the intersection ahead, engine idling. Carlos watched as the officer inside did a double take, eyes locking onto the Mercedes. Recognition flickered across his face. His hand moved to his radio. Carlos didn't stop, didn't speed up. Just rolled forward, steady and inevitable as a storm. The police car pulled out behind him, lights still dark, maintaining distance. A predator watching prey, waiting for the moment to strike. But Carlos wasn't prey. Not here. Not tonight. He pulled into the hospital parking lot, tires hissing on wet asphalt. The squad car followed, stopped 20 feet back. The officer stepped out, hand resting on his holster. Carlos killed the engine, gripped the steering wheel with both hands, knuckles white. "She doesn't want to see you." Amber Robbie had been a nurse for 7 years, long enough to know that death didn't always arrive quietly. Sometimes it announced itself with alarms and chaos. Other times, like tonight, it settled into a room like fog, gradual, inevitable, suffocating. She stood outside Sandra Perez's room, phone still warm in her hand from the call she'd made 23 minutes ago. The call that might have been the worst mistake of her career. Or the most human thing she'd ever done. "You actually called him." Amber turned. Dr. Mary Chen stood in the hallway, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between disbelief and fury. At 56, Mary had seen enough trauma, enough violence wheeled through these doors, to recognize danger by name. And she'd clearly recognized the name Carlos Wilson. "She's dying," Amber said quietly. "He's her son. He had a right to know." "He's a criminal." Mary stepped closer, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You didn't call a grieving son, Amber. You just invited the devil to a deathbed." The words landed like a slap. Amber's jaw tightened. "She's been asking for him. You heard her. She's been delirious. There's a difference between fever dreams and informed consent." Mary glanced toward Sandra's room, where the monitors beeped their steady rhythm of decline. That woman spent 30 years protecting people from men like her son. And now, in her final hours, you've brought him right to her door. He sounded. Amber stopped, searching for the right word. Broken. When I told him she didn't want to see him, he sounded human. "Monsters always do," Mary said coldly. "Right before they bite." Inside the room, Sandra Perez stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, searching the shadows for something that wasn't there. Amber moved to her bedside immediately, Mary following with reluctant duty. "Ms. Perez." Amber adjusted the oxygen cannula, checked the foredrip. "Can you hear me?" Sandra's lips moved, barely audible. Amber leaned closer. "Tell him." Sandra's voice was paper-thin, crumbling at the edges. Tell him not to come armed. Amber's blood chilled. She glanced at Mary, whose expression had shifted from anger to something darker. Confirmation. Not to come armed, Sandra repeated, her hand gripping Amber's wrist with surprising strength. He always came armed. Even to church. A sound that might have been a laugh or a sob rattled in her chest. My son, my beautiful boy, turned himself into a weapon. Mary moved to the monitors, adjusting medication levels with practiced efficiency. But Amber saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands moved just a fraction too quickly. Ms. Perez, you need to rest. I was a social worker. Sandra's eyes fixed on something beyond the ceiling, beyond the room, beyond the present. 22 years. I saved children. Pulled them from homes where love had rotted into violence. And my own son. Her voice fractured. The heart monitor spiked briefly, then settled into an unsteady rhythm. I couldn't save my own son. Amber stepped into the hallway, needing air, needing space from the weight of that confession. She pulled out her phone, checked the time. 12:17 a.m. Wilson would be here soon. Maybe already in the building. Maybe. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Again. She almost didn't answer. But something, the same instinct that had made her call Carlos in the first place, made her swipe to accept. Nurse Robbie. The voice was male, smooth, with an edge that suggested smiling while holding a knife. You don't know me, but I know you just made a very interesting phone call. Amber's throat tightened. Who is this? A concerned citizen. Let me give you some friendly advice. Stay out of Mafia business. You called Carlos Wilson. That was unwise. There are people who'd be very interested to know he's vulnerable right now. Distracted. I don't know what you're. His mother's in room 304, yes? Palliative care. Stage 4. Tragic. The voice dropped lower, colder. Hospitals are dangerous places, Nurse Robbie. People die in them all the time. Sometimes from their illnesses. Sometimes from complications. The line went dead. Amber stood frozen, phone trembling in her hand. The hospital corridor suddenly felt too long, too empty. The fluorescent lights too bright and too exposing all at once. Amber! She spun. Mary stood in Sandra's doorway, concern replacing anger for the first time tonight. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Someone just called me. Amber's voice came out unsteady. Warned me to stay out of Mafia business. They knew about Carlos. They knew Sandra's room number. Mary's face drained of color. For a long moment neither woman spoke. Then Mary moved with sudden purpose, pulling Amber back toward the nurse's station. We need to call security. Now. And tell them what? That I got a vague threat from an unknown number. Amber shook her head. They'll think I'm paranoid. You're not paranoid if they're actually coming. Mary picked up the desk phone, then hesitated. Listen to me. Sandra Perez wasn't just a social worker. She testified against the Moreno cartel in 2008. Put 3 of their lieutenants away. That testimony. It created a power vacuum. A vacuum her son filled. Amber's stomach dropped. He built his empire on her testimony. On the bodies it left behind, yes. Mary's hand hovered over the phone. She made him possible. And she's hated herself for it ever since. That's why she cut him off. Not just because of what he became, but because she gave him the throne. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Sandra's guilt. Her refusal to see Carlos. The mysterious caller's warning. If rival factions know Carlos is here. Amber whispered. Then this hospital just became a battlefield. Mary finished the thought already dialing. And we're standing in the crossfire. A commotion erupted near the emergency entrance. Raised voices, the static crackle of police radios. Amber and Mary exchanged glances, then moved toward the sound. Through the glass doors of the main entrance, Amber saw him. Carlos Wilson, standing in the rain, hands raised slightly as a police officer barked orders. He looked nothing like the monster Mary had described. He looked like a man who'd already lost everything and was begging the universe not to take the last piece. But behind him, idling at the edge of the parking lot, Amber spotted a dark sedan with tinted windows. No headlights, no movement, just waiting, watching. "Mary," Amber breathed. "I don't think Wilson's the only one who came tonight." Inside room 304, Sandra Perez's monitors began to alarm. Heart rate dropping, oxygen levels plummeting. The sound cut through the hospital like a scream. Amber ran. Behind her, Mary was already calling for the crash cart. Her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. And somewhere in the rain-soaked parking lot, the devil and his demons were circling, waiting for the moment when compassion became complicity, and a nurse's duty collided with a son's desperation. The battle for Sandra Perez's final moments had begun. The automatic doors of St. Helena Hospital opened with a pneumatic hiss that sounded to Carlos like a judge's gavel falling. He stepped from rain into sterile fluorescence, water dripping from his suit onto tile so white it felt like an accusation. 2 uniformed officers materialized before he'd taken 5 steps. The younger one's hand drifted toward his holster. Nervous, over-caffeinated, the type who'd shoot first and file paperwork later. The older officer, graying at the temples with eyes that had seen too much, stepped forward with practiced authority. "That's far enough, Mr. Wilson." Carlos stopped. Didn't argue. Didn't reach for anything. Just stood there, dripping and hollow, a king stripped of his kingdom at the threshold of the only place that mattered. "I'm here to see Sandra Perez. Room 304. Visiting hours ended at 9, the younger officer said, too eager, too sharp. "And we have strict orders." "Family only," the older officer interrupted, his tone more measured but no less final. "ICU protocol. You understand." Carlos's jaw tightened. Rain ran down his face like tears he'd never let fall. "She is family. Identification." He pulled out his wallet slowly, the type of slow that said "I'm not reaching for a gun," and extracted his driver's license. The older officer took it, studied it with theatrical thoroughness, then handed it back. "According to hospital records, Ms. Perez has no listed family, no next of kin, no emergency contacts except..." He paused meaningfully. "One number we called at her request. One number. After everything. After 15 years of silence, of restraining orders lifted and never replaced, of birthday cards returned unopened, she'd kept one emergency contact. And then told him not to come." "I'm her son," Carlos said quietly. Each word cost him something he didn't have currency for anymore. "Then you'll understand why we can't let you through." The older officer's voice softened fractionally, almost sympathetic. "She was very specific about her wishes, Mr. Wilson. No visitors. Especially not you." The words landed like bullets, cleaner than the ones Carlos had taken in his ribs 3 years ago, deadlier than the knife wound that had nearly killed him at 26. Those injuries had healed. This one wouldn't. "I need to see her." "Sir." 5 minutes. Through the glass. "I won't go in. I won't disturb her. I just need..." His voice cracked, the fault line finally breaking through. "I just need to see her." The officers exchanged glances. The older one sighed, the sound of a man making a decision that would haunt him either way. "Observation window only. You don't touch the door. You don't make a sound. And if I see your hand move toward anything, you're in cuffs." "Understood." Carlos nodded. Words had abandoned him. They escorted him through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair, past rooms where other people's tragedies played out behind curtains and closed doors. Carlos barely registered them. His entire world had narrowed to a single room number. 304. When they reached it, the older officer positioned himself between Carlos and the door, then gestured toward the observation window with his chin. Carlos stepped forward and saw her. Flashback, 2008, Federal Courthouse. Sandra Perez sat in the witness box, hands folded, voice steady despite the threats that had been spray-painted on her apartment building the night before. Carlos, 23 and already neck-deep in the life, sat in the gallery, watching his mother testify against Ricardo Moreno, Kingpin Butcher, the man who'd once offered Carlos a position in his organization. Mrs. Perez, you worked with the Moreno family's youngest son as his caseworker, is that correct? Yes. Miguel Moreno. He was 14 when I was assigned his case. Suspected abuse. And what did you discover? Sandra's voice didn't waver. I discovered that Ricardo Moreno used his children as drug mules. Miguel had been hospitalized twice for internal injuries consistent with ingesting cocaine packages. When I reported it, I received death threats. When I refused to recant, they killed my supervisor. The courtroom erupted. The judge gavelled for order. Carlos sat frozen, watching his mother dismantle an empire with nothing but the truth. 3 months later, Ricardo Moreno died in federal prison, shanked in the shower, the hit ordered from outside. Power vacuum lasted 6 weeks. Carlos filled it in 7 days. He blinked, and the memory dissolved. Through the observation window, Sandra looked impossibly small, a woman who'd once seemed invincible, who'd faced down cartels and corrupt politicians and the ugliest parts of humanity, now reduced to bones and blankets and the mechanical wheeze of oxygen. Nurse Amber stood beside the bed, adjusting and for. Dr. Chen checked monitors with grim efficiency. And Sandra. Sandra's eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths that seemed to require her entire remaining strength. She'd built her life on saving people. And he'd built his empire on the corpses her testimony had left behind. The older officer cleared his throat. You've seen her. Time to go, Mr. Wilson. Carlos didn't move. Couldn't. His hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed like a man drowning, reaching for salvation that was already gone. Does she know I'm here? His voice was barely audible. I don't know. But even if she did, she wouldn't want to see me. I know. Carlos's reflection stared back at him in the glass. A ghost in an expensive suit, a man who'd won everything and lost the only thing that mattered. How long does she have? The officer hesitated. I'm not a doctor. How long? Hours. Maybe less. The door to room 304 opened. Nurse Amber emerged. Exhaustion carved into every line of her face. She stopped when she saw Carlos, recognition flashing in her eyes. This was the voice from the phone, now given flesh and ruin. Mr. Wilson. She approached cautiously, the way one might approach a wounded animal. Dangerous, yes, but also suffering. I need to see her, Carlos said immediately. I know what she said. I know she doesn't want, but I need to see her. Please. Amber's expression softened with something that might have been pity. I'm sorry. I have to honor her wishes. Then tell her I'm here. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her. He stopped, the words piling up in his throat, choking him. Tell her anything. Just let her know. Mr. Wilson. Amber glanced at the officers, then back to Carlos, making a decision that could cost her everything. She left something. Letter. Sealed. She made me promise to give it to you. After. His heart stopped. After. After she's gone. Those were her instructions. Let me see it. I can't. Let me see it. The shout erupted from somewhere primal, echoing down the corridor. Patients stirred. Nurses appeared in doorways. The younger officer's hand went to his weapon. But Carlos didn't move toward them. He just stood there, fists clenched, chest heaving, a man watching the last thread of his humanity being cut while he was forced to stand and witness. Amber held her ground, though fear flickered in her eyes. She trusted me to honor her wishes. I have to. She's my mother. The word broke on his tongue. Everything I have, everything I am, it came from her. He testified, and I built my throne on the graves she helped dig. She made me possible. And she hates me for it. And he stopped. Breathe. When he spoke again, His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every sin he'd committed, every line he'd crossed, every soul he'd sent into darkness. If she dies without seeing me, I'll burn this place down. Not a threat. Prophecy. A promise to a universe that had already taken too much. Amber's face paled. The officers tensed. But before anyone could respond, an alarm shrieked from room 304. Sharp, insistent, the sound of a life slipping away. Carlos's eyes went wide. No, not yet. Amber was already running back into the room, Dr. Chen's voice sharp with commands. Get the crash cart. Now. And Carlos stood at the window, hands pressed against glass that might as well have been concrete, watching nurses swarm around his mother's bed, watching monitors spike and flatline, watching the only person who'd ever loved him unconditionally fight her final battle. While he stood outside, powerless, locked out by the very woman whose choices had made him a king. The ghosts in these white walls weren't the patients. They were men like him, alive but already haunting the living. The crash cart arrived with controlled chaos, Dr. Chen barking orders, Amber's hands moving with muscle memory precision, syringes and paddles and the desperate machinery of postponing death. Through the observation window, Carlos watched his mother's frail body jolt with electricity, watched the flat line on the monitor spike once, twice, then settle into an unsteady rhythm that meant not yet, but soon. He'd killed men for less than the pain he felt in that moment. The older officer touched his shoulder. Mr. Wilson, you need to step back. Carlos's phone vibrated. He pulled it out, saw the name Rico, his lieutenant. The man who managed operations when Carlos couldn't. The man who knew better than to call unless the world was ending. He answered. What? Boss, we got a problem. Rico's voice was tight-clipped. Words out, you're at St. Helena. The Sinaloa crew knows. So does what's left of the Moreno family. They're mobilizing. Carlos's blood turned to ice. How? Someone leaked it. Maybe they tapped your phone, maybe they got eyes on the hospital, I don't know. But they know you're vulnerable. And they're coming. The older officer was watching him now, reading the shift in Carlos's posture, the way his free hand had instinctively moved toward his hip, where a gun would normally rest. Where nothing was tonight. I need you here, Carlos said quietly. Back in trance. 5 minutes. Boss, if the cops see me. 5 minutes. He ended the call. The officer stepped closer. Problem, Mr. Wilson. Nothing I can't handle. Carlos's eyes flicked back to the window, where Amber was checking Sandra's vitals, where his mother's chest rose and fell with mechanical assistance. I'm going outside for air. Unless that's against hospital policy. Stay where I can see you. Carlos nodded and moved toward the exit, every instinct screaming that leaving was suicide, that danger was coming and his mother was defenseless. But he couldn't protect her from inside. Not with police watching his every move. Not with his hands tied by laws he'd broken 1,000 times but couldn't afford to break tonight. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle. Rico's black Escalade pulled up exactly 4 minutes later. The window rolled down, revealing Rico's scarred face, a roadmap of the life they both led. Give me the rundown, Carlos said, leaning close. Moreno's nephew put a bounty. 50 grand for whoever takes you out while you're distracted. Sinaloa's sending their cleaner. Goes by El Silencio. Silent kills, no witnesses. He's probably already inside. Carlos's jaw clenched. Then I need to go back in. Boss, that's what they want. You're surrounded by cops, cameras, civilians. You can't make a move without exposing yourself. My mother is in there. I know. That's why they're using her as bait. Rico reached under his seat, pulled out a Glock 19. At least take this. Carlos stared at the weapon. Taking it meant crossing a line, bringing his world into hers, violating the one boundary Sandra had begged him never to cross. Tell him not to come armed. He took the gun, tucked it into the back of his waistband, hidden beneath his suit jacket. If I'm not out in 20 minutes, Carlos said, burn everything. Every stash house, every account, every piece of the empire. Make sure there's nothing left for them to fight over. Rico's eyes widened. Boss! Do it! Carlos turned and walked back into the hospital. The ICU had a different energy when he returned. Nurses moving with hurried purpose, doctors conferring in hushed tones. But it was the new arrival that caught his attention. A patient on a gurney being wheeled toward the restricted wing, accompanied by two men in civilian clothes claiming to be family. Except their shoes were wrong. Too expensive, too clean for men who'd supposedly rushed from home in the middle of the night. And the way they moved, weight balanced, eyes scanning exits, hands loose at their sides, Carlos recognized the posture. He'd trained men to move exactly that way. Predators in a hospital full of prey. He caught Amber's eye as she emerged from Sandra's room. She saw something in his expression that made her approach cautiously. Is everything? Those men? Carlos nodded toward the new patient's escorts. How long have they been here? Amber glanced over. They just arrived. Transfer from another facility. Why? They're not family. How do you trust me? Carlos's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Get security. Keep them away from my mother's room. And whatever you do, don't let them know you're suspicious. Fear flashed across Amber's face, but she nodded. What are you going to do? What I'm good at. Carlos moved through the hospital like smoke, present but unnoticed, deadly but silent. He watched the two escorts position themselves in the hallway, one near the nurse's station, one by the stairwell. Professional, efficient, waiting for him to make a move. The patient they'd brought remained on the gurney, but his eyes were open, tracking movement. Too alert for someone supposedly in medical distress. Carlos slipped into the stairwell, ascending one floor, then doubling back through a maintenance corridor he'd mapped during his surveillance. The gun pressed cold against his spine, a reminder of every promise he'd broken, every line he'd crossed. He emerged behind the escort near the stairwell. The man sensed him a second too late. Carlos struck fast, arm around the throat, cutting off air and sound simultaneously. The man thrashed, reached for his weapon, but Carlos was already dragging him backward into the stairwell, away from cameras, away from witnesses. They crashed through the door. Carlos slammed the man against concrete, the impact rattling teeth. The escort's gun clattered to the floor. Carlos kicked it away, keeping pressure on the man's throat until his struggles weakened. Who sent you? Carlos hissed. The man gasped, eyes bulging. Carlos loosened his grip fractionally, enough to allow speech but not escape. El Silencio. The man wheezed. In the gurney. Carlos's blood froze. The patient wasn't a patient. He was the killer. What's the target? The escort's lips curled into a bloody smile. Not your mother. They want you, boss. She's just bait. Course she was. They'd waited for him to be vulnerable, distracted, stripped of his armor. And he'd walked right into their trap, desperate and grieving and stupid with the kind of emotion that got men like him killed. How many? Carlos demanded. Just. But Moreno's crew. Outside, waiting. Carlos's grip tightened. The man's eyes went wide, understanding arriving too late. Wait. The sound his neck made was quiet. Clinical. A period at the end of a sentence written in violence. Carlos lowered the body gently, then dragged it behind the stairwell door, positioning it in the shadows where it wouldn't be immediately visible. His hands didn't shake. His breathing didn't quicken. This was the part of himself he knew best, the monster his mother had disowned, the part that kept her safe even as it damned his soul. He moved back into the corridor, eyes locked on the gurney. El Silencio lay still, playing his role perfectly. The second escort stood guard, unaware his partner was already gone. Carlos approached from behind, silent as judgment. The man turned at the last second, hand moving toward his jacket. Too slow. Carlos's fist caught him in the throat, crushing his windpipe. The man crumpled, choking, dying quietly while hospital life continued around them. Carlos caught him, supported his weight like a drunk friend, and guided him toward a supply closet. Shoved him inside among the linens and cleaning supplies, then locked the door. Two down. He turned toward the gurney. El Silencio's eyes were open now, watching, calculating. Their gazes met across 20 feet of sterile hallway. Recognition flashed. Predator to predator, killer to killer. El Silencio's hand moved beneath the blanket. Carlos drew his Glock. For a moment everything stopped. Nurses at their station. Patients in their rooms. Even the monitors seemed to hold their breath. Then Sandra's alarm shrieked again from room 304. And chaos descended. El Silencio moved. Carlos fired. The suppressed shot barely louder than a cough, the bullet finding its mark. Center mass, clean, professional. The hitman slumped. Carlos was already moving, dragging the gurney into an empty room, positioning the body, making it look like a patient who'd simply expired. He checked the hallway. Clear. Now. His hands were steady. His conscience was screaming. And somewhere in room 304, his mother was dying while he painted the walls with the blood of men who'd come for him. Tell him not to come armed. But he had. Because love without protection was just another word for loss. And Carlos had lost enough. The machines breathed for Sandra now. Each mechanical inhale filled the silence between Amber's prayers and the muted chaos beyond the ICU doors. Her mother's hand felt weightless in hers, paper-thin skin over bird bones, fingers that had once kneaded bread dough and braided Amber's hair now cool and still. "Mom," Amber whispered, though the doctors had said she might not hear. "I'm here." Sandra's eyelids fluttered. For a moment nothing. Then her lips parted, dry and cracked, forming words without sound. Amber leaned closer, her ear nearly touching her mother's mouth. "Paper," Sandra breathed. "Need a paper." Amber's heart lurched. She fumbled in her bag, pulled out a notebook and pen, the same one she'd used to document her mother's decline, to list medications and visiting hours and all the clinical details that kept grief at arm's length. "I'm ready," she said, positioning the pen. "What do you want to say?" Sandra's chest rose and fell with effort. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of years compressed into moments. "Tell him." A pause. Wheeze. "Tell him I forgave him long before he asked." Amber's hand froze over the page. "Mom, you don't have to. Write it." Stronger now, urgent. "I just couldn't look at what I lost." The words spilled out then, between labored breaths. Amber wrote them all, her vision blurring with tears that dropped onto the paper, smudging the ink. She didn't wipe them away. When Sandra finished, her eyes closed. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Amber read the words back, her voice breaking on every other line, but Sandra only nodded once, a small dip of her chin that took all her remaining strength. Amber folded the paper carefully, slid it into an envelope she found at the nurse's station. Her hand trembled as she wrote across the front, "For Carlos when it's time." She didn't know what time meant. Didn't know if it would be the time after her mother passed, or the time after Carlos finally broke, or some other moment she couldn't yet imagine. She only knew her mother had carried this forgiveness like a stone in her chest for 18 years, and now she'd finally set it down. Amber tucked the envelope into the nightstand drawer, beneath her mother's rosary and a photograph of Amber as a child, gap-toothed and grinning. Then she sat back down and resumed her vigil, holding her mother's hand as if she could anchor her to this world through touch alone. 3 floors below, Carlos knelt in the hospital chapel. He hadn't been inside a church since Miguel's funeral. Hadn't prayed since the night he'd begged God to take him instead, and woke the next morning to find the universe indifferent to bargains made in grief. But here he was, on his knees on the worn carpet, staring at a simple wooden cross mounted on the wall. No stained glass here, no incense or choir voices. Just fluorescent lights humming overhead and the faint antiseptic smell that permeated every corner of this building. "I don't know if you're listening," he said aloud. His voice echoed in the empty room. I don't know if I have any right to ask. His hands clasped together, knuckles white. The gesture felt foreign, like putting on clothes that no longer fit. But if she lives, he swallowed hard. If Sandra lives, I'll stop everything. The deliveries, the money, all of it. The words hung in the air. He waited for lightning, for some sign of divine acknowledgement or wrath, but there was only silence and the distant beep of monitors from the hallway. I know I'm a coward, he continued, the confession pouring out like blood from a wound. I know I broke her. Broke them both. I've spent 18 years trying to fix what can't be fixed with money that burns holes in everything it touches. He thought of Miguel's face in the morgue, peaceful in death in a way he'd never been in life. Thought of Sandra's haunted eyes every time he'd seen her across a parking lot or a grocery store aisle, the way she'd turn away as if his presence was a physical blow. Take it from me, he whispered. Take the guilt. Take the business. Take everything. Just let her live long enough to know I'm sorry. He stayed there until his knees ached and his back cramped, stayed until a nurse poked her head in to check if he was all right. He nodded, rose stiffly, and left without looking back at the cross. Carlos returned to the ICU waiting room just as Amber emerged from Sandra's room. She looked hollowed out, her face pale and drawn, eyes red-rimmed. She didn't see him, or maybe she saw him and chose not to acknowledge him. She walked past him to the vending machines, stood there staring at the rows of candy bars and chips as if they held the answers to questions too terrible to speak aloud. Carlos moved to Sandra's door, peered through the small window. She lay there, so small in the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that kept her tethered to life by the thinnest of threads. He didn't go in. Couldn't. But his gaze fell to the nightstand, and he saw Amber's bag sitting there, saw the drawer slightly ajar. The corner of an envelope peeked out, cream-colored paper with dark ink across the front. He couldn't read the words from here, but something in the way it was placed, deliberately, carefully, made his chest tighten. That envelope held something. He didn't know what, didn't dare imagine. But in that moment, kneeling in the chapel's echo, making promises to a God he'd long abandoned, Carlos understood that whatever lay inside that envelope might be his only salvation. Or his final condemnation. He stood there, watching Sandra breathe with the machine's help, and for the first time in 18 years, Carlos Mendoza felt the full weight of hope, fragile and terrifying as new life. The alarm started at 3:47 a.m. Amber jerked awake in the chair beside her mother's bed, heart hammering as nurses flooded the room. Their movements were practiced, efficient, checking lines, adjusting monitors, calling out numbers that meant nothing to Amber and everything to the medical machinery keeping her mother alive. What's happening? Amber stood, pressed herself against the wall to stay out of their way. Her blood pressure's dropping, one nurse said, fingers flying over the 4-pump. Doctor's on his way. Sandra's chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. The monitor above her bed showed erratic lines, peaks and valleys that looked like a mountain range collapsing in on itself. Amber wanted to reach for her mother's hand but couldn't move. Couldn't do anything but watch as they worked to pull Sandra back from whatever edge she was sliding toward. Carlos heard the commotion from the waiting room. He'd been there all night, slumped in a plastic chair that had left permanent aches in his spine, unable to leave but unwelcome to stay. The sudden rush of footsteps and urgent voices pulled him to his feet. He moved toward Sandra's room without thinking, propelled by something deeper than choice. Mary intercepted him at the door, her hand flat against his chest. "No," she said. Her voice was steel-wrapped in exhaustion. "She said she didn't want to see you." "Mary." She was clear about it, Carlos. For once in your life, respect what she wanted. Behind her, through the doorway, Carlos could see the nurses working. Could see Amber's stricken face. Could see Sandra's frail form barely visible beneath the chaos of medical intervention. "She changed her mind," he said quietly. "She just didn't get the chance to say it." Mary's eyes narrowed. "How would you know?" "Because I know her." His voice cracked. "Better than anyone. Even after everything, I know her. For a moment they stood there, Mary's hand still pressed against him, Carlos's gaze locked on the woman who'd carried him, raised him, lost him. The woman who was slipping away while they argued at the threshold. Mary's hand dropped. "If you upset her," she said. "If you make this worse." But Carlos was already moving past her, into the room. The nurses stepped back as Sandra's vitals stabilized slightly. Not recovered, but no longer in immediate freefall. The doctor murmured instructions about dosages and monitoring, then noticed Carlos standing there. "Family only," he started. "He is family," Amber said, her voice hollow. She didn't look at Carlos when she said it. The medical team withdrew, leaving the three of them in the sudden quiet. Just the beep of monitors and the whisper of oxygen flowing through tubes. Sandra's eyes opened, slowly like someone surfacing from deep water. Her gaze found Carlos immediately, as if she'd known all along he was there. For a moment, brief and sharp as broken glass, clarity returned to her face. "Carlos," she breathed. He moved to the bedside, fell to his knees. Not in supplication but because his legs simply gave out. His hands gripped the bed rail, and he was 12 years old again, standing in the kitchen doorway watching her cook, asking her why Dad never came home, listening to her explain that sometimes people get lost and can't find their way back. "Mama," he said. The word tasted like childhood, like every prayer he'd ever said before the world taught him that prayers were just wishes shouted into the void. Sandra's hand moved, inches across the sheet. Carlos took it, wrapped both his hands around her thin fingers. "Why couldn't you just stop, Carlos?" Her voice was barely audible, but each word landed like a stone. "Why couldn't you just stop?" The question he'd been running from for 18 years. The question Miguel had asked with his eyes in the morgue. The question Amber had asked without words every time she looked at him. "Because I didn't know how," he said, and the truth of it broke something inside him. "Not without you. I thought the money would fix it. Thought if I could just give you enough." His voice shattered. "But I didn't know how to stop, Mama. Not without you showing me." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. They slid down her temples, disappeared into her hair. "All I wanted," she whispered, "was my son. Just my son. Not the money. Not the empire. Just you." Carlos pressed his forehead to their joined hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd held back for nearly 2 decades. "I'm sorry. God, Mama, I'm so sorry." Sandra's other hand lifted, trembling, weak, and touched his head. The gesture was gentle, achingly familiar. The way she used to smooth his hair after nightmares, after scraped knees, after the world had been cruel and she'd been the only safe place left. "Then stop now," she said, and her voice carried a faint smile. "Stop now, Mijo. While there's still time to be someone else." Carlos looked up at her, saw her face, peaceful now despite everything. Saw forgiveness there, the kind he'd never dared hope for. "I will," he promised. "I swear, Mama, I will." Sandra smiled. Really smiled, the way she used to when he was small and brought her dandelions, declaring them the most beautiful flowers in the world. The monitor's beep changed pitch. "Mom!" Amber moved forward, but the sound was already flattening, stretching into a single sustained tone. Carlos felt Sandra's hand go slack in his. "No," he breathed. "No, please." But she was already gone. The machines screamed their mechanical grief while Sandra lay quiet, released from 18 years of carrying a burden she'd never asked for. Amber wept, silent tears streaming down her face as she held her mother's other hand. Mary appeared in the doorway, hand over her mouth, rosary beads clenched in her fist. Carlos remained on his knees, still holding Sandra's hand, the toughest man in the city now utterly hollow. The monitors wailed and medical staff rushed in to confirm what everyone already knew, but Carlos heard none of it. All he heard was her final word, "Stop." And in the devastating stillness that followed, Carlos Mendoza finally understood what it meant to have nothing left to lose. The rain started during the opening prayer. It came soft at first, a whisper against the funeral canopy, then harder, steady drops that drummed on the stretched fabric and turned the cemetery grass to mud. The mourners huddled closer together, but Carlos stood apart, rain streaming down his face like tears he couldn't shed on his own. No guards flanked him. No SUVs idled at the cemetery gates. No entourage of men in dark suits whispering into earpieces. Just Carlos, alone in his white dress shirt, jacket abandoned in his car, watching as they lowered his mother into the earth. The casket was simple pine, exactly as Sandra had requested years ago in a will nobody thought they'd need so soon. No mahogany. No gold fixtures. She'd written it down in her careful script. When I go, let me go simply. The way I came into this world, with nothing but love. Carlos had read those words last night, sitting in his empty office with a bottle of whiskey he never opened. He'd read them until the letters blurred and his hands stopped shaking, until he understood that his mother's final act of defiance wasn't refusing his money. It was refusing to let it define even her death. Father Martinez spoke about Sandra's strength, her faith, her devotion to family. The words were kind and true and fell on Carlos like stones. He barely heard them. All he could see was the white envelope in his hands, cream-colored paper gone soft from being carried in his pocket for 3 days. For Carlos when it's time. He'd found it after the nurses cleared the room, after Amber had collapsed in Mary's arms, after the reality of Sandra's absence had settled over them like ash. The envelope had been right there in the nightstand drawer, waiting. He'd held it, turned it over, traced the letters of his name in his mother's handwriting. He hadn't opened it. Couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because as long as the letter remained sealed, his mother's final words to him stayed suspended between forgiveness and judgment, hope and condemnation. Once he read them, whatever they said would become fixed and final, the last thing she'd ever say to him, frozen forever. So he'd carried it, slept with it on his nightstand, brought it here, to this moment, to this rain-soaked cemetery where his mother's body was being committed to the ground. When Father Martinez finished and stepped back, Carlos moved forward. His shoes sank into the mud. Rain plastered his shirt to his skin, made him shiver, but he didn't care. He knelt at the edge of the grave, held the envelope over the casket. "I don't know what you said, Mama," he whispered. "But I heard you anyway." He let the envelope fall. It landed on the pine wood, a small white rectangle against dark grain, and Carlos watched as the rain began to spot it, bleeding the ink of his name until the letters blurred into abstraction. Someone behind him, Mary maybe or one of Sandra's church friends, gasped softly, but no one stopped him. He stood, mud staining his knees, and stepped back as the cemetery workers moved in to begin filling the grave. Amber watched from beneath her umbrella, her face unreadable. Their eyes met across the rain and the open earth, and Carlos saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. As if she finally understood that the man standing in the rain without his armor was no longer the same man who'd built an empire on her brother's grave. The next morning, Carlos walked into a warehouse on the city's east side. His men looked up from counting stacks of product, their faces wary. They'd heard about Sandra's funeral. Heard he'd gone alone without protection. Heard he'd stood in the rain like a man who'd forgotten he could drown. "Boss," Raoul said, stepping forward. He was Carlos's oldest lieutenant, the one who'd been there since the beginning, when Carlos was just a kid with anger and ambition. "We need to talk about the Lopez crew. They're asking questions, probing our territory." Carlos looked at the drugs spread across the table. Kilos of powder that represented someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's Miguel. He thought of Sandra's smile, the way she'd touched his head in those final moments. "Then stop now." "Shut it down," he said. Raoul blinked. "What?" "This network. All of it. Shut it down." Silence fell over the warehouse. The men exchanged glances, uncertain if they'd heard correctly. "Carlos," Raoul said carefully, "if we pull out now, Lopez will move in within a week. We'll lose everything we've built here. Then let him have it." Carlos's voice was flat, empty of the fire that usually drove him. "Cut loose everyone on payroll. Give them 2 months severance. Destroy the product. You're not serious. Raoul stepped closer, lowering his voice. They'll see this as weakness. Every crew in the city will start circling. This is how empires fall, man. You start giving up ground, you never stop. Carlos turned to face him fully. In the harsh fluorescent light, he looked older somehow, worn down to something essential and exposed. His shirt was wrinkled, still damp from yesterday's rain. He'd forgotten to shave. The transformation was startling, from the polished kingpin to something raw and almost human. Let them circle, Carlos said. Let them think I'm weak. Let them take whatever they want. He paused, met each man's eyes in turn. I'm done. Done. Raoul's face reddened. Carlos, listen to yourself. Your mother just died. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking clearly for the first time in 18 years. The words hung in the air. Raoul opened his mouth to argue further, then closed it. Something in Carlos's eyes stopped him. A finality that couldn't be negotiated or reasoned with. You're making a mistake, Raoul said finally. I've been making a mistake, Carlos replied. This is me trying to stop. By the end of the week, word had spread through the city's underworld like wildfire. Carlos Mendoza was dismantling his empire, pulling out of territories, cutting ties. His rivals couldn't believe their luck. His allies feared contagion, as if his sudden conscience might be catching. Amber heard about it from a friend who worked at the community center. Apparently Carlos had anonymously donated enough money to keep the place running for 5 years, then walked away without waiting for thanks or recognition. She found herself driving past his office building one evening, saw him leaving alone, walking to his car without the usual convoy. He moved differently now, slower, as if carrying weight that couldn't be measured in muscle or bone. He looked broken. Or perhaps, she thought as she watched him drive away into the falling dusk. He looked free for the first time since Miguel died. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with clouds. Somewhere beneath the earth, an unopened letter was dissolving into pulp, its words returning to the soil unread. And Carlos Mendoza, the toughest man in the city, was learning to walk through the world without his armor. It was, Amber realized, the bravest thing she'd ever seen him do. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, elegant script announcing the grand opening of St. Helena Hospital's new palliative care wing. Amber held it in her hands, standing in the kitchen of the apartment she'd finally been able to afford, a modest place with actual sunlight and neighbors who didn't deal from their living rooms. You are cordially invited to attend the dedication ceremony. She almost didn't go. These past 6 months had been about moving forward, about letting grief settle into something she could carry without it crushing her. She'd started back at school, picking up the nursing degree she'd abandoned after Miguel died. Started sleeping through the night again. Started, slowly, to remember her mother's laughter instead of just her pain. But something about the invitation pulled at her. Maybe the date. Exactly 6 months since Sandra's funeral. Maybe the location, the hospital where her mother had spent her final days. Maybe just the need to mark the moment, to acknowledge that time had passed even when it felt like standing still. So she went. The new wing was beautiful in a way that felt intentional. Warm woods and soft lighting, large windows that let in natural light, rooms designed to feel less like medical spaces and more like sanctuaries. It was everything St. Helena's old palliative ward hadn't been. Comfortable, dignified, peaceful. Amber wandered through during the reception, accepting champagne she didn't drink, making small talk with hospital administrators and donors. Father Martinez was there, looking older but somehow lighter, as if Sandra's death had released something in him too. Your mother would have loved this, he said, gesturing at the space around them. All this light. Amber nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The dedication ceremony began in the main gathering room. Hospital board members gave speeches about compassionate care and serving the community's most vulnerable. They thanked the anonymous donor whose extraordinary generosity had made the wing possible, a contribution so substantial it had funded not just construction but an endowment for ongoing operations. Anonymous, Amber thought. In this city, where every donor wanted their name carved in marble, who gave millions and asked for nothing in return. Then she saw the plaque. It hung in the central corridor, brushed bronze mounted on warm cherry wood. The letters were simple, elegant. The Sandra Perez Compassion Center. For every life that strayed too far, may love be the road home. Amber's champagne glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor in slow motion, crystal shattering into 1,000 pieces that caught the light like tears. People turned to look, concerned voices asking if she was all right, but Amber couldn't hear them, could only stare at her mother's name rendered permanent, immortalized not in grief but in hope. For every life that strayed too far, she knew. Suddenly, completely, she knew. Amber left through the side entrance, barely registering the rain that had started to fall. The parking lot stretched before her, cars gleaming under streetlights, and there, in the far corner, away from the valet and the other guests, she saw it. Black sedan. Not the flashy SUVs he used to favor, but something quieter, understated. The engine was running, windshield wipers moving in steady rhythm. She walked toward it without thinking, rain soaking through her dress. As she got closer, she could see him through the glass. Carlos sitting behind the wheel, staring up at the hospital. At the lit windows of the wing he'd built. At the building where his mother had died and where, now, other mothers might die with more grace, more dignity, more comfort. He saw her approach. For a moment neither moved. Then Carlos turned off the engine, stepped out into the rain. They stood there, 10 feet apart, water streaming between them. He looked different, thinner, his face carved into new lines, wearing a simple jacket over a shirt that had never seen a designer label. No jewelry, no affectation. Just a man standing in the rain, stripped of everything but the weight of what he'd done and who he was trying to become. "You didn't come inside," Amber said. Her voice was steady, stronger than she'd expected. "Wasn't my place," Carlos replied. "This isn't about me. You put her name on it. She earned it." He looked down at his hands, rain pooling in his palms. "Everything I've done, every choice, every mistake, it all led to her dying in a room that felt like a cage. Can't undo that. Can't bring Miguel back. Can't give you your family." He met her eyes. "But maybe someone else's mother won't have to die in the dark." Amber felt something crack open in her chest. Not forgiveness, not quite, but something close. Recognition, maybe. Acknowledgement that the man who destroyed her family and the man standing before her were the same person, and also completely different. "She forgave you," Amber said quietly. "In the letter. She told me what she wrote." Carlos's face crumpled for just a moment before he composed himself. "I know," he said. "I didn't need to read it. Felt it. In those last minutes with her, I felt it." The rain fell harder. Amber's hair was plastered to her face, her dress ruined, but she didn't move. Neither did Carlos. "What will you do now?" she asked. Carlos looked back at the hospital, at the warm lights of the Sandra Perez Compassion Center glowing against the dark sky. "Try," he said simply. "Just try to be someone she wouldn't be ashamed of." Amber nodded slowly. She thought of her mother's final smile, of the peace that had settled over her face when she'd told Carlos to stop. Thought of Miguel, forever 23, forever frozen in the moment before everything went wrong. Thought of all the lives broken and scattered in the wake of choices made in darkness. "Okay," she said. It wasn't absolution. Wasn't an invitation back into her life. Just acknowledgement that trying mattered. That change, however late, however incomplete, was still change. Carlos's shoulders sagged with relief. Or maybe exhaustion. He started to say something, then stopped. Some things didn't need words. He got back in his car. Started the engine. Amber stepped back, giving him space to pull away. As his taillights disappeared into the rainy night, bleeding red across wet pavement, she heard his voice in her memory. The last thing he'd said at Sandra's bedside, "I will. I swear, Mama, I will." The city lights flickered across his windshield as he drove, each one a life, a story, a chance to be different. The rain washed the streets clean, temporary and insufficient, but somehow still necessary. They say a man like me can't change, Carlos thought as he merged into traffic, the hospital shrinking in his rearview mirror. Maybe they're right. Maybe all I've done is trade one kind of penance for another, blood-stained money for buildings with my mother's name. Maybe redemption is something you chase forever without ever catching it. But for her, for the woman who gave me life twice, once at birth and once in dying, I had to try. The road stretched before him, dark and rain-slicked and uncertain. Behind him, in a building made from guilt and grief and the desperate human need to make something good from something broken, Sandra Perez's name glowed in bronze. Marker. A memorial. A promise that even lives that strayed too far might still find their way home. Or at least, Carlos thought as the city swallowed him whole, they could spend the rest of their days trying. Thank you for staying with me till the very end of this story. Every view, every comment, every moment you spend here keeps these stories alive. If you felt this one, make sure to subscribe, and let me know you watched to the end.